Well, good morning and welcome to 2023, which is just a weird thing to say, it feels like, because there's a big piece of me that cannot believe that it is 2023. I remember celebrating the changing over of the year in the year 2000, and that just feels so long ago and yet also feels like yesterday. But wherever we are, however we are here, and it is indeed 2023. Now, New Year's is an interesting time, and people do different things during the New Year. And of course, one of the popular things to do is to make the New Year's resolution, right? That's, you want to make a change in your life. You want to do something a little different. Maybe you want to learn a new skill or lose some weight or get more active or whatever it is. That this seems to be a time when people do that, and it's become such a cliche, actually. There's almost this backlash against it, that somehow doing this is a bad thing. I personally don't agree, right? Anything we do in life, right? Any change we want to make, whether it's to ourselves or others or a situation, or we want to change jobs or schools or whatever, any change we want to make needs a starting line, right? You can't reach the finish line until you start at the starting line. And the new year is as good a starting line as any. So I would just encourage you right off the bat, if you are planning or thinking or have made any New Year's resolutions, that's not a bad thing. And in fact, I would encourage you to do so if you haven't. Are you going to keep them all? No. Are they all going to go the way you want them to? No. But also, that's okay. Because sometimes the biggest thing you can do is show up at the starting line and give your best to whatever it is that you want to do. Now, believe it or not, this actually has something to do with today's scripture, because what's going on in this Isaiah passage is, first of all, the book of Isaiah is a giant book of prophecy in kind of like the late middle of the Old Testament. Originally, it was actually broken up into three different books because it was so long. Most practically because it was so long, it wouldn't all fit on one scroll. So there was 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. Today, we kind of lump it all together. But it also covers different periods of time. Isaiah is probably a compilation of different prophecies that happened at different times in the life of God's people. This part that we're dealing with today, this section of Isaiah today, comes at a very particular part in the life of God's people. And it comes at a time when during and at the end of the Babylonian exile. So we think about God's people, especially God's people in the Old Testament time. We will think about Moses and, the fact that, they were slaves in Egypt and all of that. Maybe we think about David, his time, King Solomon, all those sorts of things. But the Babylonian exile, which, happened in, the 5th, 6th century BC, was actually a huge event in the life of God's people. And it was still probably one of the events that cast the biggest shadow over the life, Jewish life at the time of Jesus, even so many centuries later, because it was, frankly, the most recent thing that they had gone through. So what ends up happening is, before the exile, God's people are in their land that God promised them, and things go astray, and they don't do what they're supposed to do, and all that stuff that we hear about all the time in the Old Testament. And the Babylonian Empire grows bigger and bigger and stronger, and eventually consumes Israel, consumes the place where the Jews are living. And when they are consumed, a large number of them, not all of them, but a large number of them, including a lot of their leaders, are actually carried off back to Babylon, where they basically serve in what really was slavery. And they were there for a number of decades, under that, oppression, really, where, this is what was going on. So, and during this time, obviously, God's people continue to be God's people, and they continue to make new little God's people, and the population grows. So not only do we now, at the point that Isaiah is writing this particular prophecy from God, we have not only the people who were carried away, even though it's been so long, there's probably very few of them left. And what you have is a group of people that are actually born into exile, born into Babylon. And Isaiah comes with this prophecy to let them know that the time is nearing for God to do something that will allow them to return home, return back to the land God promised them from this time that they've spent in Babylon. So what Isaiah is doing here is he's helping the Jews understand that there's going to be very soon a new starting line, right? That God, I love that last passage, do you not, I am preparing to do a new thing, do you not behold it, right? God is saying there's going to be a new starting line. There is a new thing that is about to happen. And the new thing that is about to happen is things are going to come together so that you can actually go home. I've often wondered how people received this at the time. Because for so many folks, sure, they knew that they were Jewish. They knew the stories. They were no doubt told them. They tended to stick together, as people living under slavery tend to do. They tend to marry each other and make families with each other. So no doubt they were still a fairly cohesive group at this time, but this idea of home and this idea of Jerusalem and Israel being home was an idea. They knew of it, but very few, if any, people alive at that time and at that moment had ever seen it or experienced it. So how much like home could it feel or could it be for them? So I've often wondered how it is they receive this because, if going home, is about going back, right? Going home, going back to where you came from, looking back at where you've been and being there again. And yet, God doesn't say, I'm sending you back, right? God doesn't even really say, I'm sending you home. God says, I'm doing a new thing. And the new thing is that you will be returning where you're coming from. God knows, and God wants his people to know that even though they are going home, it does not mean that things are going to be as they were. And in fact, because we know where the story goes and we have all the history that follows this, we know that that's true as well. When God's people do, spoiler, when God's people do get to return back to the land and leave exile, the Israel that they go back to, the place that they go back to is far different than the place that they left. One is that it didn't just sit there empty the whole time, right? Other people have moved in. So it's a much more diverse group. The temple was destroyed, so the temple wasn't there, and that's going to have to be rebuilt. There were all these changes, and truthfully, even the ones that stayed, even the ones that remained in the land and didn't get carried off, were so few in number that it's not till that great population returns from Babylon that there is enough of them for them to be a real force in what is supposed to be their own home. So, yeah, they're going home, and God is doing a new thing. So this new thing that God is doing is sending them back where they were, knowing that they are in some ways going home, but also will be in fact building a new home where they will be shortly. I've been fascinated. I love to talk to people and hear the experience of people who have been and lived in the same place for their whole lives, or at least most of their whole lives. And maybe they're one of those families that goes back, not only them, but their mom and their grandparents and these roots and history all in one place. I've often wondered what the sense of home and what the sense of place must be if that is your history. And of course, we have a great number of people in our church who are in that particular situation. A great number of you have been here in this actual place. Some of you not, within blocks of where it is that you grew up. You live today, and you have your parents and your grandparents around, and the grandkids, and it's many generations living in the same place at the same time. I'm fascinated by that because it is so not my experience. I often, as you know, as anybody who's been around here knows, I definitely claim that I am from Montana, right? Like if I am from a place, and if anybody asks me where I'm from, like where do I feel is home to me, I would say there. And it is the place that I have spent the most years of my life. If you add up kind of the growing up years in college and then living there before coming here, definitely it is the state that I have spent the most numbers of years in. And yet, even though I would claim that as my place and my home, I could not call myself a native, right? Because I wasn't actually born there. In fact, we traveled to many different places and actually country, my family did, before eventually landing in eastern Montana. So, while I say I am of and from Montana, and that is the place that I would call home, my passport will tell you that I was actually born in Spain. I am not Spanish. This often confuses people, especially at Customs and Immigration, trying to get into or out of this country, especially, because they look at me and they're like, "You are not Spanish?" I'm like, I am not Spanish, but I was actually born on a Navy base there, which is why, like several of the others of you, we had a bit of a nomadic life for a while. Recently, over Christmas break, I got to visit my family. Now, none of my family lives in Montana. And in fact, I would gather that of my family, especially my immediate family, or really all of my family, I'm probably the only one that would claim Montana as home, and I am the only one who has lived there as long as I have lived there. Everybody else lives and is of other places. So I got to go visit my family, but visiting my family doesn't actually mean going north to Montana. In fact, the only family that we have to visit going north to Montana is my wife's family. To visit my family, I actually have to go south to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so that's where we went. And as it happens, my wife and I, early in our marriage, happened to live in Albuquerque, New Mexico as well. What's interesting there is even though my aunt and my uncle live there, and my mom lives there, and my brother and my sister and my niece live there, and my grandparents lived there until they passed away, there's only one of that whole group that is actually from and of that place, and that is my aunt. Right? And she, I don't believe, is even from Albuquerque, but is from kind of New Mexico in general. But that became the seed. When they got married, they moved there, kind of built a life there. And then when my grandparents retired, they were looking for a place to retire to, and they decided, oh, that looked like a good place to go. So after some wandering, they ended up there. And then while I was actually in college, my mom and my brother were looking for something new and a different place to go. So they actually left Montana and moved down there as well. And then when my wife wanted to change degree programs to something that the Montana state didn't offer, if you can imagine, we went looking for schools that would offer a good competitive program. And as it happens, University of New Mexico did. And I thought, well, I've been there because I visited my family. It seems nice, and we would have family around. That seems nice. So that's how we ended up living down there for about 5 years. And what was fascinating when we went down to visit for just those 3 days you drive around, and even though things have changed, you still see a lot of things that you remember. And it's very amazing to me how quickly like that internal map kicks in, and suddenly I'm in a place that I can navigate without GPS, even though I haven't been there, in a number of years. But eventually that kind of clicks in, and there's a place that even if you haven't been there a long time, starts to feel very familiar. And we, of course, spent some time with my family. We spent some time with some friends that we had from college. My wife, when she was in college there, we had a great night with some of our friends from that time. And it struck me, amongst all of that even though I currently live in Colorado, I would call Montana my home, as the place I am from. I also would have to admit that in those 3 days, I felt very at home where I was down there in New Mexico. And I began to wonder, knowing that we were going to talk about this and the sermon was coming up, like, why that was. And the truth is, the thing that made it feel like home was, yes, the familiar stuff around it. And yes, we lived there long enough to really learn to love and crave green chili, and just really enjoyed finally being served sopapillas with honey again, because that is just the best thing ever. Those sorts of things. The thing that made it feel like the most home were the people that were there. Right? Even though we kind of lived there at different times and at different stages in life, to be in that place with people that I knew and loved and cared about, doing the things that we do, falling back into the old routines and old conversations, even though maybe some of these people we haven't seen in years, picking up, really feeling like we were picking up where we are leaving off. It's the people. It's the people in that place. And it's the memories of what happened with the people in that place. Rarely do we drive by something and say, oh, I remember that building, right? Oh, I remember that building over there. We drive by and go, that building is the building where my son was born. And of course we tell the story, even though he doesn't want to hear it, of that day and what it was like. The hospital itself isn't actually really all that important to me. What happened there and who it happened with is incredibly important to me. The truth is, it really is people. It is the people around us that make home. So God can say to his people, he can say to the people who lived in exile their whole lives and actually don't know anything about Israel and where it is they're going to be going to, he can say to them with certainty, I am going to do a new thing and send you home. And he can have certainty that it will be home for them because they've heard the stories, they know what happened there, and they are going to go not individually, but they're going to go as a group. And because they will be together, because the people will be together, families will be together, and that is how they are going to return, it will be home, and it will become home again because of who they are with and what happened. So sometimes we can feel like we don't have a home. Sometimes I think we can feel like if you're like me and kind of lived this nomadic lifestyle, we've been here, there, and everywhere, you can look at people who maybe did it differently, who've been in the same place with a little bit of like interest and occasionally a little bit of jealousy. I really am curious, and of course we'll never know what it is to feel like such a part of a place because you have been there your whole time. But the comfort that I take is that no matter where we are, no matter where physically we are existing or living, that does not determine what home is. What determines what home is are there people around us? Are we with people that we love and care for, and that love and care for us? I think one of the best things that we do as a church, and this church, despite having so many people who have been here for a very, very long time, One of the most important things we do as a church is that we open ourselves up so bigly and so wide for any and all who might want to come, who we might encounter, and we invite them in, even if they've only lived here for the last 24 hours, or if they've lived here for the last 24 years, or the last 5 decades. The thing that I love that we do the most is we continue to keep ourselves open to the idea that God is doing new things in people's lives, and the new thing that God is doing in some people's lives may be to bring them here, and for this to become home for them. And what we know, as God's people, what we know from all of the stories that we have is how important it is for something to become home, how important it is for there to be people around who love and care for you that you also get to love and care for. I love that we are a community that allows that to happen. This is in no way, and I recognize this from the first time I entered this place, we are in no ways a closed or kind of walled off group, but instead we continue to have hearts and minds and arms open to any and all we may be blessed to encounter. It also means, and I think this, we can take this from the passage as well, it also means that we have to be prepared for God to do new things in our midst, do new things in the life of those of us who have been here a long time. We need to prepare for God to deliver to us new opportunities to be in service and love for one another, and for God to deliver us new people to love and invite in. And finally, and most importantly, we cannot just sit around and wait for that to happen. We must go. We must go out into the world, into this community that we have been given and entrusted to care for and love. And we must go and find those who perhaps are new, find those for whom this is not home yet, and give them all the love and care and support that we can, in hopes that this will become a home for them as well. Because God's people are going to have to leave what they know. They're going to have to leave the home that most of them have lived their entire lives with, and head out into this new thing that God is doing, in faith and trust that where they are going will become home for them as well. And similarly, the people who are there, the ones that never left the land, are going to need to receive and go out and find these people who are returning and help them find home there as well. When we do that work, when we invite people in and allow people to become part of us, and allow who they are to help shape who we are doing God's work in the tradition of building home that God has been doing for literally millennia. So it is a new year. Let us trust that God is doing new things. Let us trust that God is doing new things amongst those of us who feel very well planted in this place. God is doing new things amongst those of us who feel a little bit more nomadic in our spirits and in our souls. God is doing new things all the time, all around us, so that we can create a better sense of home, a better sense of place and belonging, not just for those of us who are gathered here, but absolutely for us too. But for all of those around us who we are called to be Christ's hands and feet to, who we are called to love and support, and we are called to make home for them as well. Let us do that. And when we do, we can trust that we are doing the work we are called to do. Amen.